Sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight. Sometimes silence becomes your only friend when the whole world has turned against you. In a small village where candles burn against the dark, Elswyth has pretended to be mute for 8 long years. The villagers think she's just a quiet woman who helps make their candles. They don't know she once served royalty. They don't know she watched her masters die. They don't know she carries secrets that could destroy kingdoms. For 8 years, she has lived in peace. But tonight, under a blood moon, the alpha vampire Lord Arjun arrives in her village. He destroyed everything she loved decades ago. Now he's found her again. He recognizes her instantly, seeing through her disguise. But instead of killing her, he offers her a deal. What could the monster who ruined her life possibly want with a woman who has spent 8 years in hiding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Thornwick like a widow's veil, and Elswyth moved through it as she had every dawn for 8 years, silent, purposeful, invisible. Her weathered hands clutched a wicker basket filled with fresh candles, their waxy scent mingling with the damp earth and wood smoke that perpetually shrouded the village. At 52, she had learned that invisibility was an art form, and she had perfected it through necessity rather than choice. The candle shop stood at the corner of Market Lane and Pilgrim's Rest, a narrow building squeezed between the baker's cottage and a cobbler's workshop like a forgotten thought. Its timber frame bore the scars of countless winters, and its windows were clouded with age. But to Elswyth, it represented something precious sanctuary. Master Willem had given her work when no one else would take in a mute woman with calloused hands and haunted eyes. "Morning, Elswyth," came Willem's gruff voice from behind the counter as she entered. He was a man of 60 winters, his beard more silver than brown now, his back bent from decades of leaning over vats of melted wax. His kindness ran deeper than most understood, evidenced by the fact that he had never once pressed her about her past, or questioned why a woman of her obvious education, for he had noticed her careful handling of numbers and her ability to read the most complex of orders had appeared. And in his shop one morning 8 years ago, desperate for work and speaking not a word, Elswyth nodded her customary greeting, a slight bow of the head accompanied by what passed for a smile. She set her basket on the worn wooden counter and began arranging the candles she had finished the night before. Each one was perfect, the wicks scented, the wax smooth, the colors even. It was work that required patience and attention to detail, qualities that her former life had, cultivated, and her current circumstances demanded. The candle ledger lay open beside the till, its leather binding soft with age and handling. Master Willem believed Elswyth kept track of their daily sales in its pages, and she did, but in the margins, written in a script so small it might have been mistaken for decorative flourishes. She recorded other things, thoughts she could not speak aloud, memories that threatened to consume her if left unrecorded, poetry that helped her remember who she had been before silence became her shield. Today's entry, written the night before by candlelight, read, "The mountain grows restless. Even the ravens speak of change." Elle would have loved the way the morning light catches the frost. 23 years gone, yet I still set aside the finest taper for her memory. Elle, Princess Lyanna, the name she could never write in full, never speak, never forget. The young woman whose laughter had once filled palace corridors, whose trust had been Elswyth's greatest honor, whose death had been Elswyth's greatest failure. In her previous life, before Thornwick, before the candles and the silence, Elswyth had been Lady Elswyth Ravencrest, handmaiden to the royal house of Valdemere. She had braided Princess Lyanna's golden hair each morning, had read to her from books of poetry and philosophy, had been closer to the royal family than many of their blood relatives. Those days felt like someone else's life now. Someone braver, someone who had worn silk instead of homespun wool, someone who had spoken freely and walked with her head held high. That woman had died the night the vampires came, the night everything burned, the night she had been forced to choose between truth and survival. Elswyth? Master Willem's voice pulled her from her reverie. She looked up to find him studying her with concern, his weathered face creased with worry. "You seem troubled this morning, lass. More so than usual." She touched her throat, their established signal that she wished she could explain but could not, and then gestured toward the window, where storm clouds were gathering over the distant peaks. It was not entirely a lie. The weather had been strange lately, unseasonably dark, with winds that carried scents from places that should have been too far away to reach them. The animals sensed it too. Horses grew skittish at dusk, and the village dogs howled at shadows. "Aye, there's something in the air," Willem agreed, following her gaze. "Old Marta says it reminds her of the storms that came before the vampire wars, 25 years past. But that's just an old woman's fancies, surely." Elswyth's blood chilled at the mention of the vampire wars, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She knew more about those wars than anyone in Thornwick suspected. She had lived through them, had seen their aftermath, had lost everything when they ended. The fact that Marta, the village's unofficial keeper of memory and gossip, was drawing such comparisons made her stomach clench with dread. The bell above the door chimed, and young Thomas stumbled in, his arms laden with bundles of dried herbs and his freckled face flushed from running. At 14, he served as the shop's delivery boy and general assistant, though his enthusiasm often exceeded his coordination. Elswyth had grown fond of him over the years, perhaps because his presence reminded her of the younger pages who had once scurried through the palace halls. "Master Willem," Thomas panted, setting down his bundles with more force than necessary. "There's news from the northern road. Travellers saying strange things. They are. Talk of lights in the sky over the cursed borderlands, and sounds that ain't natural." Willem frowned. "What sort of sounds?" "Howling, but not from wolves. And singing, but not from any throat that draws breath." Thomas's eyes were wide with the kind of excitement that only the young could muster in the face of potential danger. "Some say it's the dead walking again. Others reckon it's vampires stirring up trouble." Elswyth's hands stilled on the candles she had been arranging. The cursed borderlands lay 3 days' ride to the north, too close for comfort, if something supernatural was indeed stirring there. She had chosen Thornwick precisely because it was far from the great powers, tucked away in mountains that offered both protection and obscurity. The idea that those protections might be failing made her chest tighten with familiar panic. "Bah!" Willem said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Tales grow in the telling, lad. Likely nothing more than a merchant caravan with too much ale and too little sense." But Elswyth noticed how his gaze drifted to the window, how his hand moved unconsciously to the iron pendant he wore at his throat. Iron was said to ward off supernatural creatures, though she had learned from bitter experience that no amount of iron could protect against a vampire who truly meant you harm. The morning passed in its usual rhythm, despite the undercurrent of unease. Customers came and went, farmers' wives seeking beeswax candles for their churches, merchants requiring travel torches, the occasional traveller looking for something to light their way through the mountain passes. Elswyth served them all with her customary silence, accepting payment with nods and gestures that had become as familiar to the villagers as spoken words. During the midday lull, she retreated to the back room, where the great vats of wax waited to be transformed into candles. The work was meditative, requiring just enough attention to keep her hands busy while allowing her mind to wander. She dipped each wick with careful precision, building up the layers of wax slowly, methodically. The rhythm was soothing, familiar, safe. But even here, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the comforting scent of beeswax, she could not escape the growing sense that change was coming. It whispered to her through the mountain winds that rattled the shutters. It gleamed in the unusual darkness of the storm clouds that had been building all day. It pulsed in the silver pendant she wore beneath her simple brown dress, the pendant that had once belonged to Princess Liana, that held secrets worth killing for. As afternoon faded toward evening, old Marta shuffled into the shop, her bent frame wrapped in layers of shawls despite the day's warmth. She was nearly 80, the oldest resident of Thornwick, and her mind held more memories than the rest of the village combined. Elswyth had always been grateful for Marta's presence. The old woman's stories and observations provided a window into the community's thoughts and fears. "Evening, Willem," Marta croaked, settling onto the stool they kept by the counter for her daily visits. "Evening, dear," she added to Elswyth with a gentle smile. Marta had never shown the slightest impatience with Elswyth's muteness, treating her instead with the kind of maternal affection that had been absent from her life for too many years. "What brings you out so late, Marta?" Willem asked, though they all knew she came at this hour every day to collect the gossip and share her own observations. "Strange dreams," Marta said without preamble. "Been having them for 3 nights running now. Dreams of blood and moonlight, of creatures with too many teeth and eyes like winter nights." She shivered despite her layers of wool. "My grandmother used to tell tales of such dreams, said they came before times of great change." Elswyth's hands trembled as she lit the evening candles, though she quickly steadied them. Dreams of blood and moonlight. How often had she awakened from such visions over the past 8 years, gasping and soaked with sweat as memories of that terrible night replayed behind her closed eyelids. "Just dreams, surely," Willem said, but his voice carried doubt. "Perhaps," Marta replied. "But the animals know something's coming. Horses won't cross the bridge after dark, and the ravens have been flying in circles over the old church ruins. When nature holds its breath, wise folk pay attention." As if summoned by her words, the wind picked up outside, sending leaves skittering across the cobblestones, like tiny harbingers of doom. The candle flames flickered in response, casting dancing shadows across the shop's walls. Elswyth found herself touching the pendant beneath her dress, feeling its familiar weight against her skin. The pendant was her most precious and most dangerous possession. Crafted from silver and set with a stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, it had been Princess Lyanna's most treasured piece of jewelry. But more than sentiment made it valuable, the pendant was a key, one of 3 artifacts that could unlock the location of something so powerful that wars had been fought for it. Something that vampire lords would kill to possess. As the evening wore on and the last customers departed, Elswyth helped Master Willem close the shop for the night. They worked together in comfortable silence, banking the fires, covering the vats of wax, securing the valuable finished products. It was a routine they had performed countless times, yet tonight it felt different, more final, as if they were sealing away more than just a day's work. "Will you be all right walking home in this weather?" Willem asked, as they prepared to part ways. The wind had grown stronger, and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall. Elswyth nodded and pulled her cloak more tightly around her shoulders. Her cottage lay only a few streets away, down a narrow lane that most villagers avoided after dark due to old superstitions about the abandoned well at its center. She had chosen the location precisely because of its isolation, though the irony was not lost on her. She had fled from one kind of darkness only to voluntarily embrace another. The walk home was treacherous, with the wind threatening to tear her cloak away and the rain turning the cobblestones slick as ice. But she had walked this path in all weather for 8 years, and her feet knew every stone, every puddle, every place where the ancient pavement had cracked and shifted. The cottage came into view just as the storm reached its full fury, its windows glowing warmly with the light of the fire she had left banked that morning. Inside, surrounded by the simple comforts she had accumulated over the years, Elswyth finally allowed herself to acknowledge the fear that had been building all day. She pulled the pendant from beneath her dress and held it up to the firelight, watching the way the stone seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. On nights like this, when the boundary between the mundane and the supernatural felt thin, she could almost imagine she heard whispers emanating from its depths. Princess Lyanna's voice, calling her name. Lord Argan's cold, laughter echoing through palace corridors, the screams of the dying on that night 23 years ago when everything changed forever. She had thought herself safe in Thornwick, had believed that 8 years of silence and careful anonymity had been enough to erase Lady Elswyth Ravencrest from existence. But as the storm raged outside and shadows danced across her cottage walls, she began to suspect that safety had always been an illusion. Some debts could never be paid, some hunts never ended, some truths never stayed buried. The pendant grew warm against her palm, and for one terrifying moment she thought she saw a flash of red light within its depths, the same crimson glow that had filled the sky the night Princess Lyanna died. Then the moment passed, leaving her alone with the storm and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed new life was about to come to an end. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like the laughter of ancient gods, and Elswyth, Ravencrest, known to Thornwick only as the mute candlemaker's assistant, prepared for the reckoning she had always known would come. The blood moon rose like a wound in the sky, casting everything in shades of crimson and shadow. Elswyth had seen such moons before they came, perhaps once every few years, astronomical events that stirred old superstitions and made even the bravest souls bar their doors. But this one felt different. This one pulsed with malevolent energy that made her pendant burn against her skin, even through the layers of cloth. She had barely slept, tossing restlessly as the storm battered her cottage, and strange dreams plagued what little rest she managed. Dreams of golden hair stained with blood, of a young woman's voice calling her name across impossible distances, of eyes like winter frost watching her from the darkness. When dawn finally came, grey and reluctant, she rose feeling more exhausted than when she had retired. The village seemed subdued as she made her way to the candle shop, though whether from the previous night's storm or some deeper unease, she could not say. Shutters remained closed despite the late hour, and the few people she encountered moved with hurried steps and averted gazes. Even the usually cheerful baker merely nodded grimly as she passed his shop, the scent of fresh bread failing to lift the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Thornwick. Master Willem was already at work when she arrived, his movements sharp with nervous energy. "Terrible night," he muttered, without looking up from the ledger where he was recording inventory. Terrible night indeed. Lost 3 shutters to the wind, and something spooked the horses so badly that half the village was up trying to calm them. Elswyth nodded sympathetically while her mind raced. Spooked horses often meant supernatural presence. She had learned that lesson during her time at court, when the royal stables had housed steeds, trained to detect creatures of the night. If something had frightened every horse in Thornwick simultaneously, it suggested a threat far greater than wind and rain. The morning passed slowly, with fewer customers than usual venturing out. Those who did come seemed eager to complete their business and leave, speaking in hushed tones about strange sounds they had heard in the night and lights that had danced across the mountain peaks despite the storm clouds. Elswyth served them with her usual silent efficiency, while dread pooled in her stomach like cold water. It was just past midday when the temperature in the shop suddenly dropped. Not the gradual chill of a cloud passing over the sun, but an immediate, bone-deep cold that made her breath mist in the air. Master Willem paused in his work, frowning at the sudden change, but before either of them could react, the shop door opened. The man who entered was tall and imposing, his dark hair touched with silver despite his apparent youth. He wore traveling clothes of fine black wool, cut in a style that suggested both wealth and practicality. His pale skin seemed to glow with its own inner light, and his eyes, those eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, ancient and knowing in a way that spoke of centuries rather than decades. Elswyth's world tilted on its axis. She knew that face, had seen it in nightmares for 23 years. Lord Argan Draculeshti, alpha vampire of the northern wastes. The monster who had destroyed everything she had ever loved. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of the old nobility. It was cultured, refined, yet underneath lay something predatory that made every instinct scream at her to run. "I wonder if you might assist me. I am looking for someone." Master Willem stepped forward, his natural courtesy warring with obvious unease. The cold in the shop was now so intense that frost was beginning to form on the windows. "Of course, my lord, though I'm afraid our village is small. Most everyone knows everyone else here." Arjun's lips curved in what might have been a smile, if not for the complete absence of warmth in his eyes. "How fortunate. The person I seek would be a woman, perhaps in her middle years. She might work with her hands needlework, perhaps, or some other craft requiring delicate attention to detail." As he spoke, he moved closer to the counter, and Elswyth felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her eyes downcast, praying that 8 years of simple living had changed her enough that recognition would not be instant. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it was futile. Vampires did not forget, and Lord Arjun had always been the most perceptive of his kind. "She would be perhaps 50 years of age now," he continued, his gaze seeming to catalogue every person in the shop. "Once, she was quite lovely, though time may have refined her beauty. She has a particular skill with languages and literature, though she might hide such talents." Now, Willem glanced at Elswyth with obvious confusion. The description was close but not exact. Elswyth was known to be mute. After all, hardly someone with particular linguistic skills. "I'm not sure I know anyone who—" Arjun's hand moved to his coat and withdrew something that made Elswyth's blood freeze. An obsidian signet ring that seemed to drink in the light around it. The ring of the Draculeshti line, passed down through generations of vampire lords. As he placed it deliberately on the counter, the temperature dropped even further, and her pendant began to burn against her skin with an intensity that made her gasp. The gasp was her undoing. Arjun's head turned toward her with predatory swiftness, and those ancient eyes locked onto hers with the force of a physical blow. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the vampire lord, studying her face with growing satisfaction while she stood frozen like a rabbit before a wolf. "Ah," he said softly, and in that single syllable was recognition, triumph, and something else she could not identify. "Lady Elswyth Ravencrest. How very long it has been." Master Willem's confusion deepened. "My lord, I think there's been some mistake. This is just Elswyth, my assistant. She's been mute since the night she fled Castle Valdemir with blood on her hands and secrets in her heart," Arjun finished, never taking his eyes off her. "Though I suspect the muteness is rather more choice than affliction. Isn't that right, my lady?" Elswyth's carefully constructed facade crumbled like autumn leaves. Her hands shook as she pressed them against the counter, fighting the urge to either flee or collapse. 23 years of guilt and terror rose in her throat like bile, but still she would not speak. Arjun seemed amused by her continued silence. "Still playing the mute? How? Dedicated. Though I suppose it has served you well these many years." He moved closer, and she could smell the scent that always accompanied his kind winter air and old roses, beautiful and deadly. "Did you think I would not find you eventually? That 8 years of hiding among these simple folk would be enough to erase what you are, what you stole from me." The words hit her like physical blows. Whatever else Lord Arjun might be, he was not the same creature who had terrorized the kingdoms decades ago. There was pain in his voice now, old and deep, that spoke of losses she could not fathom. Master Willem was backing away from the counter, his face pale with dawning understanding. "Elswyth," he said uncertainly, "what is he talking about?" But Elswyth could only stare at Arjun, her mind reeling. What she had stolen? She had stolen nothing. She had been the victim, the accused, the one who had fled in terror as everything she loved burned around her. "I see confusion in those lovely eyes," Arjun murmured, reaching across the counter with supernatural swiftness to catch her chin in his cold fingers. His touch was gentle but inescapable, forcing her to meet his gaze. Perhaps we have much to discuss, you and I. Perhaps the truth is more complicated than either of us realized all those years ago. Behind him, the shop door opened again, and Thomas stumbled in, chattering excitedly about some village gossip. The boy's words died in his throat as he took in the scene, the impossibly cold air, the frost on the windows. Master Willem's terrified expression, and the dark stranger who held Elswyth's fate in his pale hands. Arjun glanced at the boy with mild irritation. "How inconvenient," he murmured. With a gesture almost too quick to follow, he moved his free hand in the air, and Thomas's eyes rolled back in his head. The boy crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. "Sleep," Arjun said simply. "He will wake in an hour with memories of nothing more than a pleasant nap." His attention returned to Elswyth. "Now then, my lady, shall we continue this conversation somewhere more private? Or would you prefer to conduct our business here in front of your employer?" The word carried subtle menace, and Elswyth knew without doubt that Master Willem's life hung in the balance. Whatever Arjun wanted, whatever game he was playing, innocent people would suffer if she did not cooperate. She had learned that lesson the hard way, 23 years ago. Slowly, with hands that shook like autumn leaves, she reached up and touched her throat. Then, for the first time in 8 years, she spoke. "What do you want?" Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the frigid air. Arjun's smile was sharp as a blade. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Was that so difficult? What I want, my dear Lady Elswyth, is simple. You are going to help me find something that was lost long ago. Something that requires your particular expertise to locate. And if I refuse—" "Oh, you won't refuse," he said with perfect certainty. "Because the alternative is that I tell the world exactly who you are and what you carry. How long do you think your peaceful little life would last if certain parties knew that Princess Liana's handmaiden still lived? How long before the bounty hunters and treasure seekers descended on this charming village like locusts?" Her heart sank as the trap closed around her. He knew about the pendant, about its significance. Of course he did. He had probably known all along, had been watching and waiting for the right moment to spring his snare. 24 hours, he said, releasing her chin and stepping back. "Meet me at the old church ruins tomorrow at sunset. Come alone, and come prepared to travel. We have a long journey ahead of us, you and I." He moved toward the door with fluid grace, then paused. "Oh, and my lady? Do not even think of running. There is nowhere in this world you could hide that I would not eventually find you. And next time, I might not be so considerate of your neighbor's well-being." The door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and immediately the temperature began to return to normal. Master Willem stared at her with wide, frightened eyes, while Thomas stirred groggily on the floor. Elswyth sank onto the stool behind the counter, her legs no longer able to support her weight. Her voice, unused for so long, felt foreign in her throat as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Willem. I'm so very sorry." But even as the words left her lips, she knew that apologies would not be enough. Lord Arjun had found her at last, and with him came all the sins and secrets of her past. Her carefully built new life was about to crumble, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hours that followed Lord Arjun's departure passed in a haze of disbelief and mounting panic. Master Willem had helped young Thomas to his feet, the boy confused but unharmed, remembering nothing of the vampire lord's presence. But Willem's eyes never left Elswyth, filled with questions she was not yet ready to answer. "You spoke," he said finally, after Thomas had been sent home with instructions to rest. 8 years I've known you, and you spoke." Elswyth sat hunched on the stool, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The words felt strange on her tongue, like speaking a half-remembered language. "I had to," she whispered. "He would have hurt you otherwise. Who was he? What did he mean about Castle Valdemir, about Princess Lyanna? Willem's voice carried the hurt of betrayal alongside genuine concern. What secrets have you been keeping, lass? The question hung between them like a sword poised to fall. Elswyth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 23 years pressing down upon her shoulders. How could she explain that she had once lived in marble halls and worn silk gowns? That she had braided a princess's hair each morning and read to her from books of poetry in 3 different languages? That she had been present when the royal family died, had been blamed for their deaths, had fled into the night with their blood on her hands and their most precious artifact hidden beneath her clothes. My name, she began slowly, is Lady Elswyth Ravencrest. I was handmaiden to Princess Lyanna of Valdemir. The words felt like stones in her mouth, each one harder to speak than the last. 23 years ago, vampires attacked the castle. The entire royal family was slaughtered. I was accused of betraying them to their killers. Willem's face went pale. The fall of Valdemir was known throughout the realm, a tragedy that had ended one of the oldest royal bloodlines and plunged the northern kingdoms into chaos. You were there? I was more than there. I was blamed. Elswyth's voice cracked with old pain. They said I had given the vampires information about the castle's defenses, about where the family would be most vulnerable. It wasn't true, but truth mattered little when everyone needed someone to blame. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the afternoon light slanted through the glass. Outside, Thornwick continued its peaceful existence, unaware that its quiet candlemaker carried the weight of kingdoms in her heart. I escaped that night, but barely. I've been running ever since. Her hand moved unconsciously to the pendant hidden beneath her dress. And now he's found me. Willem absorbed this revelation in silence, his weathered face creased with thought. Finally, he asked, "What does he want from you?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but Lord Argan was there that night. He was one of them, the vampires who destroyed everything I loved. The memory of Princess Lyanna's laughter, bright and musical, rose unbidden in her mind. Whatever he wants, it cannot be anything good." As if summoned by her words, Princess Lyanna's music box seemed to pulse with warmth where it lay hidden in her cottage. She had carried it with her through 8 years of exile, one of the few precious things she had managed to save from the flames. The delicate silver music box had been Lyanna's most treasured possession, a gift from her grandmother that played a haunting melody when opened. But it held secrets beyond sentiment, secrets that Elswyth had discovered only years after fleeing the castle. "You could leave," Willem suggested quietly. "Tonight, before he returns. I have a cousin in the eastern provinces who would take you in, no questions asked." Elswyth shook her head. "He would find me, and when he did, he might take his anger out on this village, on you and Thomas and Marta and everyone else who showed kindness to a stranger." She had learned the cost of running, had seen what happened to those who harbored fugitives. "I won't bring that upon Thornwick. Then what will you do?" The question she had been avoiding since Argan's departure. What could she do? Submit to his demands and hope for mercy? Try to bargain with a creature who had lived for centuries and commanded power beyond mortal comprehension? The pendant beneath her dress seemed to burn hotter, as if responding to her distress. "I need to understand what he truly wants," she said finally. "And for that, I need to remember things I've spent 8 years trying to forget." That evening, after helping Willem close the shop and enduring his worried protests about her safety, Elswyth returned to her cottage as the sun set behind the mountains. The familiar rooms felt different now, smaller somehow, as if Argan's presence had contaminated even her most private sanctuary. She lit a single candle and sat at her small wooden table, then carefully withdrew the music box from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The silver gleamed in the candlelight, and the tiny painted roses on its lid seemed almost alive in the flickering shadows. She had not opened it in months. The melody it played was too painful, too full of memories she could not afford to revisit. But tonight was different. Tonight she needed to remember. The lid opened with a soft click, and immediately the haunting tune began to play. The melody was beautiful and heartbreaking, each note crystalline and pure. As it played, Elswyth closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift back to those golden days before everything went wrong. She remembered Princess Lyanna dancing to this very song in her private chambers, laughing as she spun around the room with her arms outstretched. She remembered quiet afternoons when they had read together by the window, the princess's head resting on Elswyth's shoulder as they shared stories and dreams. She remembered the night before the attack, when Lyanna had pressed the music box into her hands and spoken words that had seemed like nonsense at the time. "If anything should happen to me, Elswyth," the princess had said, her young face unusually serious, "remember that music holds more than melody. The song my grandmother taught me, it's more than just a lullaby. Promise me you'll remember." At the time, Elswyth had assumed it was just the fanciful talk of a romantic young woman. But later, much later, she had discovered that the music box held a false bottom, and within that hidden compartment lay a map not drawn on parchment, but encoded in the very structure of the melody itself. The song contained directions to something the princess had called the most dangerous treasure in the realm. Now, as the melody played in her cottage's candlelit darkness, Elswyth wondered if this was what Arjun sought. The vampire lord had mentioned something lost, something requiring her particular expertise to locate. Who else but a royal handmaiden would know the significance of a princess's lullaby? The music box completed its cycle and fell silent, leaving her alone with the candle's flame and the weight of understanding. Lord Arjun had not found her by accident. He knew exactly what she carried, exactly what knowledge she possessed. The question was whether he intended to use her as a tool or eliminate her as a threat. A sound outside made her freeze, the soft scraping of footsteps on her cottage's path. For a moment, she thought Arjun had returned early, but the footsteps were too light, too hesitant. She moved to the window and peered through the shutters to see a familiar bent figure approaching her door. Old Marta stood in the gathering darkness, her shawls wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders, and her eyes bright with an urgency that seemed out of place in her ancient frame. Elswyth opened the door before the old woman could knock. "Marta? What brings you out so late?" "I had to come," Marta said, stepping inside without invitation. Her gaze immediately found the music box on the table, and her eyes widened with something that might have been recognition. "The dreams have been getting stronger. Dreams of blood and silver, of songs that carry more than music." She looked up at Elswyth with startling intensity. "You're her, aren't you? The one from the stories, Princess Lyanna's handmaiden." Elswyth's heart skipped. "I don't know what you mean." "Child, I'm old, not blind." Marta moved to the table and gently traced the music box's painted roses. "My grandmother served in the castle kitchens when she was young. She told me stories about the princess and her devoted handmaiden, about a music box that held secrets worth dying for." The old woman's eyes met hers. "She also told me about the night the vampires came and how the handmaiden was wrongly blamed for the tragedy. The admission hung between them like a bridge suddenly revealed in the darkness." Elswyth sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the realization that her carefully guarded secret had been known, at least partially, by someone in Thornwick all along. "Why didn't you say anything?" she whispered. Marta's smile was gentle and sad. "Because you needed time to heal, and because the truth has a way of surfacing when it's meant to." Her expression grew serious. "But now danger has come to our village, hasn't it? The vampire lord who visited your shop today, I could feel his presence like ice in my bones." Elswyth nodded, no longer seeing any point in denial. "Lord Arjun, he wants me to help him find something." "Then you'll need to be very careful, child," Marta said, reaching out to cover Elswyth's hand with her own papery fingers. "For I suspect that what he seeks may be the very thing that doomed Princess Lyanna's bloodline all those years ago. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough." Elswyth had spent the night sleepless, alternating between pacing her small cottage and staring at the music box that now sat openly on her table. Marta's words echoed in her mind like a prophecy of doom. What he seeks may be the very thing that doomed Princess Lyanna's bloodline. The old woman had departed after sharing what little she knew of her grandmother's stories, leaving Elswyth alone with the weight of approaching destiny. The village stirred to life around her as she prepared for what might be her last day in Thornwick. She dressed carefully in her sturdiest travelling clothes, though she kept her appearance humble. The pendant lay heavy against her chest, and she added the music box to a small leather satchel, along with what few possessions she could not bear, to leave behind a letter from Princess Lyanna, written years before her death, a pressed flower from the palace gardens, and the silver thimble she had used for needlework in her former life. The walk to the candle shop felt like a procession to her own execution. Every familiar sight, the baker's window with its display of morning bread, the cobbler bent over his workbench, the children chasing each other through the square, seemed precious and fragile, as if she were seeing them for the last time. Master Willem was waiting for her, his face grave with worry and determination. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you told me yesterday, about the vampire lord and what he wants from you." Elswyth nodded, not trusting her voice. The words still felt foreign after 8 years of silence. "There's something you should know," Willem continued, moving to a cabinet behind the counter. From within, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "Something I've kept hidden, waiting for the right time to reveal it." He unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing an object that made Elswyth's breath catch in her throat. It was a compass, but unlike any she had ever seen. The metal casing was covered in intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the morning light, and the needle inside pointed not north, but toward something else entirely, something that hummed with magical energy. "The Wayfinder's compass," Willem said quietly. "My father was a treasure hunter in his younger days, before he settled down to become a Khanum, a candle maker. He found this in the ruins of an ancient temple, though he never fully understood its purpose. It points toward objects of great magical significance." Elswyth stared at the compass, watching as its needle swung slowly to point directly at her chest, directly at the pendant hidden beneath her dress. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because for 8 years, ever since you came to work here, it's been pointing at you." Willem's eyes were kind but serious. "I knew you carried something important, though I respected your privacy too much to ask what. But now, with that vampire lord seeking you out," he pressed the compass into her hands, "you'll need every advantage you can get." The compass was warm to the touch, and she could feel power thrumming through it like a heartbeat. "Willem, I can't take this. It's too valuable. It's yours, by right," he insisted. "My father always said it would know its true owner when the time came. I think that time is now." Before she could protest further, the shop door opened with a violent crash that sent candles tumbling from their displays. The temperature plummeted instantly, and through the doorway stepped Lord Argan, his pale eyes scanning the shop with predatory interest. "Good morning," he said, his cultured voice cutting through the sudden chill like a blade. "I trust you slept well, my lady." Elswyth straightened, clutching the compass in her hands. "As well as could be expected, given the circumstances." Argan's gaze fell on the compass, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "How interesting. A Wayfinder's compass. I haven't seen one of those in centuries. Wherever did you acquire such a thing?" "It was a gift," she said carefully, not wanting to involve Willem any more than necessary. "Indeed." Argan stepped closer, and she caught that familiar scent of winter air and dying roses. "How fortuitous. You'll find it quite useful for our journey." "Journey?" Despite knowing this moment would come, hearing it spoken aloud still sent ice through her veins. "Of course. Did you think I would simply take your word about the location of what I seek?" His smile was sharp as a winter wind. "No, my dear Lady Elswyth. You and I are going to travel together to retrieve the Sanguine Crown." The name hit her like a physical blow. The sanguine crown, the most dangerous artifact in the realm, the source of power that could command all vampire lords. Princess Lyanna had spoken of it in whispers, had hidden its location in the very melody of her music box. It was the treasure that had doomed the royal bloodline, the prize that vampire lords had been seeking for centuries. "I don't know where it is," she said, though the lie felt weak even to her own ears. "Come now," Arjun chided gently. "We both know that's not true. Princess Lyanna was clever, too clever for her own good. She encoded the crown's location in that charming little lullaby of hers. Didn't she? And who would be better positioned to understand that code than her devoted handmaiden?" Behind the counter, Willem shifted nervously, and Arjun's attention snapped to him like a hunting cat noticing movement. "Ah, yes, the shopkeeper. How inconvenient." "Leave him out of this," Elswyth said quickly. "He knows nothing about any of this." "Perhaps," Arjun mused, moving closer to Willem with fluid grace. "But he does know you, doesn't he? Has come to care for you over the years. Such attachments can be problematic." The threat was clear as crystal, and Elswyth felt the familiar weight of impossible choices crushing down upon her. She had fled Castle Valdemar to escape this very situation, innocent people suffering for her secrets. She would not let it happen again. I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "But only if you swear to leave this village in peace. No harm comes to anyone here, no matter what happens on our journey." Argen considered this, his head tilted like a bird studying prey. "Very well," he said finally. "I give you my word as a lord of the old blood. No harm will come to your precious villagers as long as you cooperate fully with my requirements." "And what exactly are those requirements?" "Simple." He withdrew something from his coat, a black rose, perfectly preserved and radiating an aura of otherworldly beauty. "You will wear this as a symbol of our alliance and as protection against others of my kind who might seek to interfere. You will guide me to the sanguine crown using whatever knowledge you possess. And you will do both of these things willingly, or our agreement becomes null and void." The midnight rose. Elswyth had heard legends of such flowers, gifts given by vampire lords to those under their protection, imbued with power that could shield the wearer from supernatural assault. To accept it would be to formally acknowledge their partnership, but to refuse would be to condemn everyone in Thornwick to whatever vengeance Argen might devise. "Do I have a choice?" she asked. "There is always a choice," Argen replied. "The question is whether you can live with the consequences of whatever you choose." She looked around the shop one last time, memorizing Willem's worried face, the familiar warmth of the space where she had found peace for 8 years. Then she reached out and took the rose from Argen's pale fingers. The moment it touched her skin, she felt power flowing through her, dark, ancient and utterly alien, yet somehow protective. The Thornwick church bell began to toll without any visible hand pulling its rope, its bronze voice echoing across the village in slow, measured peals. The sound seemed to mark the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another, filled with dangers she could barely imagine. "Excellent," Argen said with satisfaction. "Now then, shall we begin our journey? The crown has waited centuries to be found. I see no reason to delay any longer." As they prepared to leave the shop, Elswyth caught Willem's eye one last time. In that look, she tried to convey everything she could not say, her gratitude for his kindness, her sorrow at leaving, her hope that this sacrifice would keep them all safe. The bell continued to toll as they stepped out into the morning light, its voice following them as they began their walk toward the edge of Thornwick and whatever destiny awaited beyond. The cursed borderlands stretched before them like a wound in the earth, a desolate expanse where nothing grew, and the very air seemed to whisper of ancient sorrows. They had been traveling for 3 days, leaving the familiar mountains of Thornwick far behind and entering territory that existed on no current maps. Here, the aftermath of the vampire wars still lingered like a fever that would not break. Elswyth adjusted her cloak against the bitter wind that swept across the barren landscape, her eyes fixed on the wayfinder's compass in her palm. Its needle had been pointing steadily northwest since they had left the village, though she had not yet revealed to Arjun the true significance of its direction. The music box in her satchel seemed to pulse with warmth whenever she checked the compass, as if the two artifacts were communicating across the centuries. "Tell me about the night Princess Liana died," Arjun said suddenly, his voice cutting through the howling wind. He had been largely silent during their journey, speaking only when necessary, but now his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "Why?" she asked, pulling her cloak tighter. "What purpose would it serve to relive that horror? Because the truth of that night is more complicated than either of us understood at the time." He paused in his stride, turning to face her fully. "You were blamed for betraying the royal family to vampire assassins. But tell me, did you ever wonder why the attack came precisely when it did? Why the vampires knew exactly where to find the princess, when she should have been safely hidden in her private chambers?" Elswyth's step faltered. The servants talked. "There were spies. There were," Arjun agreed. "But not the ones you think. Not you, certainly. You were as surprised by the attack as anyone, weren't you? As horrified by the carnage as any loyal servant would be." The memory rose unbidden. Princess Liana's scream cutting through the night, the scent of smoke and blood, her own desperate flight through corridors that had once felt like home. "Of course I was horrified. I loved her like a sister." "Yes," Arjun said quietly. "I could see that, even then. It's why I let you escape." The words stopped her cold. "What did you say?" "You heard me correctly." His expression was unreadable, ancient and sad. "I was there that night, yes, but not as an attacker. I was trying to prevent the massacre, not orchestrate it." Elswyth stared at him, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. You're lying." "Am I?" "Think back, Lady Elswyth. Think carefully about what you actually saw that night." He moved closer, and she could see her reflection in his pale eyes. "Did you see me kill anyone? Did you witness me giving orders to the attackers?" She opened her mouth to say yes. Of course she had seen him leading the assault, but the words died in her throat. The memories were fragmentary, confused by terror and grief. She remembered seeing him in the corridors, remembered his presence during the chaos, but the specific details eluded her. "I saw you there," she said weakly. "You were there when she died." "I was," he admitted, "because I had received word that an attack was planned, and I was trying to warn the royal family. I arrived too late to prevent the slaughter, but not too late to see you fleeing through the gardens with blood on your dress and tears on your face." "You're lying," she repeated, but the conviction was gone from her voice. "The vampire who organized that attack was named Valdris," Arjun continued. "He sought the sanguine crown, just as I seek it now, but his methods were rather more direct. Slaughter the royal bloodline, torture the survivors until one of them revealed the crown's location. It was crude, wasteful, and ultimately unsuccessful." Valdris? The name stirred something in her memory, a whispered conversation she had overheard between two guards, talk of a rival vampire lord who had been gathering forces in the Eastern Territories. But she had assumed it was just court gossip, meaningless chatter among soldiers. "If what you say is true," she said slowly, "then why was I blamed? Why did everyone believe I had betrayed them? Because someone needed to take the blame, and you were convenient." Arjun's voice carried old anger, though whether directed at her or at those who had accused her, she could not tell. A handmaiden with no powerful family to protect her, no allies to speak for her innocence. It was easier to blame you than to admit that their security had been compromised from within. They resumed walking, but the landscape around them seemed different now, less desolate, more tragic. These were the bones of villages that had been caught between warring vampire factions, places where innocent people had paid the price for supernatural ambitions. Elswyth found herself looking at the ruins with new eyes, wondering how many other innocents had been blamed for tragedies they had not caused. "Why didn't you speak for me?" she asked. "If you knew I was innocent, why didn't you tell them?" Arjen's laugh was bitter as winter wind. And who would have believed the word of a vampire lord against the convenient narrative they had constructed? My testimony would have condemned you more surely than their accusations. The truth of that stung because she could see it clearly. A vampire defending her would have been seen as proof of her guilt rather than evidence of her innocence. The political machinery of blame had been set in motion, and nothing could have stopped it. They crested a low hill, and before them stretched the ruins of what had once been a prosperous town. Broken walls rose from the earth like teeth, and the remnants of a great church stood silhouetted against the grey sky. But what drew Elswyth's attention was the way the wayfinder's compass needle swung sharply as they approached, pointing directly toward the ruined church. "We should shelter there for the night," Arjen said, following her gaze. "The walls will provide protection from the wind, and there are things moving in these lands after dark that are best avoided." As they picked their way through the rubble-strewn streets, Elswyth found herself studying her traveling companion with new awareness. If his story was true, if he had been trying to save Princess Lyanna rather than kill her, then everything she had believed about that night was wrong. The guilt she had carried for 23 years, the shame that had driven her into hiding, the terror that had kept her silent, all of it based on a misunderstanding. But could she trust him? He was still a vampire lord, still a creature of immense power and inhuman appetites. Even if his motives had been pure 23 years ago, what guarantee did she have that they remained so now? The compass grew warm in her hand as they approached the church ruins, and she noticed something else, scratches in the stone walls that looked almost like writing. Not human script, but something far older, carved with supernatural strength and precision. "What does it say?" she asked, pointing to the markings. Arjen studied the ancient symbols for a moment. "It's a warning," he said finally, "written in the old tongue of my people. It says, 'Here lies the folly of kings and the wisdom of fools. What was hidden shall be revealed, but at a price beyond imagining.'" Elswyth shivered, and not just from the cold. "Do you think it refers to the crown?" "Possibly. Or it might refer to something else entirely. These borderlands are full of lost treasures and forgotten curses." He gestured toward the church entrance. "Shall we make camp? We still have far to travel, and you'll need your strength for what lies ahead." As they settled among the ruins for the night, Arjen surprising her by conjuring a small fire with a gesture, Elswyth found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew. The vampire lord who had haunted her nightmares was proving to be more complex than she had ever imagined, capable of gentleness, burdened by his own regrets, perhaps even deserving of something other than her hatred. The realization was more disturbing than comforting. Hatred had been her shield for 23 years, the emotion that had kept her going when grief threatened to overwhelm her. If she could not hate Lord Argen, what would take its place? The ruins of Castle Nightfall emerged from the morning mist like the bones of some ancient leviathan, its broken towers clawing at the sky with desperate fingers. Elswyth had never seen the fortress in its glory days, but even in ruin it was magnificent, a testament to the ambition and artistry of a bygone age. The wayfinder's compass trembled in her hand as they approached, its needle spinning wildly before finally pointing directly at the castle's heart. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Arjen said, his voice carrying an odd note of nostalgia. "I knew the lord who built this place, Count Nightfall, they called him. He believed he could create a sanctuary where vampires and humans could coexist peacefully. What happened to him?" Elswyth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The same thing that happens to most idealists," Arjen replied with bitter humor. "Reality intervened. Valdris happened to him." They had been walking for 6 days now, and Elswyth was beginning to understand the complex history that bound the vampire lords together. It was not merely a matter of good and evil, as she had once believed, but of competing philosophies about how supernatural beings should relate to the mortal world. Some, like Arjun and the late Count Nightfall, sought coexistence or at least mutual tolerance. Others, like Valdris, viewed humans as nothing more than prey and resources to be exploited. The castle's main gate hung open, its massive doors torn from their hinges by forces she did not want to contemplate. As they passed through into the outer courtyard, Elswyth noticed that nature had begun to reclaim. The fortress vines crept up the walls, and wildflowers had sprouted between the cobblestones. There was something both beautiful and melancholy about the sight, as if the earth itself was trying to heal the wounds of old violence. "We should be careful," Arjun warned, his senses alert in a way that reminded her of his predatory nature. "These ruins may appear empty, but appearances can be deceiving. Nightfall was a collector of magical artifacts, and some of them may still be active." As if summoned by his words, a low humming filled the air, not quite sound, not quite vibration, but something that seemed to resonate in her bones. The music box in her satchel grew warm against her hip, and she found herself humming along with the strange melody without conscious thought. "Elswyth," Arjun said sharply, catching her arm. "Stop humming." She blinked, realizing she had been walking toward the castle's inner keep without making a conscious decision to do so. What happened? "A siren's trap, one of Nightfall's security measures. The castle is trying to lure you somewhere specific." His pale eyes studied her face with concern. "The question is whether it's responding to your presence or to something you carry. The music box." Even as the thought crossed her mind, she could feel it pulsing with warmth, as if Princess Liana's lullaby was trying to harmonize with the castle's ancient song. She pulled the box from her satchel and opened it, allowing the familiar melody to spill out into the courtyard. The effect was immediate and startling. The castle's humming changed pitch, becoming deeper and more complex, and suddenly doors that had been sealed for decades began to swing open throughout the fortress. Lights flickered to life in windows that had been dark for years, and the very stones seemed to vibrate with renewed purpose. "Extraordinary," Arjun murmured. "The music box isn't just a key, it's a master key. Princess Liana's lullaby was designed to activate the castle's deepest defenses. But why would she have such a thing?" Elswyth asked, though even as she spoke, understanding began to dawn. Unless she knew something would happen to her, unless she was preparing. Liana was far more intelligent than anyone gave her credit for. Arjun agreed. She suspected Valdris was planning something, didn't she? That's why she hid the crown's wide location in her lullaby, and why she gave you the tools to find it if she didn't survive. They followed the music box's melody deeper into the castle, through corridors that came alive at their approach. Tapestries unfurled themselves, revealing scenes of vampire history painted in threads of silver and gold. Statues turned their stone heads to watch them pass, and more than once, Elswyth caught glimpses of ghostly figures in the periphery of her vision, the shades of those who had died defending this place. "I want to ask you something," Arjun said as they climbed a spiral staircase toward the castle's central tower. "And I want you to answer honestly. During all those years you spent with Princess Liana, did you ever suspect that she might have feelings for someone she shouldn't?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean? Did she ever speak of any vampire lords with particular interest, any meetings or correspondences that seemed unusual?" Elswyth's step faltered as memories surfaced unbidden. Late nights when Liana had sat by her window, staring out at the mountains with an expression of longing that had nothing to do with the landscape. Letters that arrived without official seals, written in handwriting she had not recognized. The way the princess's face would light up when certain names were mentioned in court. There was someone," Elswyth admitted slowly. "She never told me who, but I could see the signs. The way she would smile when reading certain letters, how she would spend hours choosing what dress to wear for seemingly ordinary occasions. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. Was it you?" Arjun was quiet for a long moment. "Liana was remarkable," he said finally. "Beautiful, intelligent, compassionate, everything one could wish for in a potential ally or partner. She saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. That's not an answer, isn't it? He paused on the stairs, turning to look at her, with those ancient, knowing eyes. She believed that peace between our peoples was possible. She thought that if a vampire lord and a human princess could find common ground, perhaps it might serve as an example for others. Elswyth felt something twist in her chest, not quite jealousy, but something close to it. The realization disturbed her more than she cared to admit. You were planning to court her. We were planning many things, Arjun said softly. A formal alliance between the vampire lords and the human kingdoms, trade agreements that would benefit both peoples, perhaps, eventually, something more personal. His expression grew dark. Valdris learned of our correspondence. He couldn't allow such an alliance to form. It would have interfered with his own plans for conquest. So he killed her to prevent it. He killed her to send a message. To me, to any other vampire lord who might consider working with humans rather than ruling them. Arjun resumed climbing, his movements sharp with old anger. And he framed you for the betrayal to ensure that no one would look too closely at his own involvement. They reached the top of the tower, emerging into a circular chamber that took Elswyth's breath away. The room was filled with books, not just shelves, but towers of volumes that reached toward a ceiling painted with constellations that moved slowly across the artificial sky. Ancient texts in languages she could not identify sat alongside illuminated manuscripts that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But what drew her attention was not the books, but the object in the center of the room, a pedestal carved from black stone, and upon it a single black rose identical to the one Argan had given her in Thornwick. The midnight rose, she breathed. But you thought yours was unique? Argan smiled, moving to the pedestal with reverent steps. There are only 3 in existence. This one belonged to Count Nightfall. Mine, I gave to you. And the third, his expression grew grim. The third belongs to Valdris. As he spoke, the rose on the pedestal began to glow with soft, silver light, and Elswyth felt the one pinned to her dress respond with warmth that spread through her entire body. It was more than magical protection, it was a connection, a bond that linked her to something larger than herself. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means you are under the protection of the old laws," Arjun replied. "Laws that even Valdris cannot ignore without consequence. And it means—" he hesitated, as if the words were difficult to speak. "It means that I trust you completely, Lady Elswyth Ravencrest. More than I have trusted anyone in centuries." The admission hung between them, like a bridge suddenly revealed in the darkness. Elswyth found herself looking at him with new eyes, seeing not the monster from her nightmares, but a man, if vampire lords could be called men, who carried his own burdens of loss and regret. "The crown isn't here," she said suddenly, consulting the compass. Its needle was pointing away from the castle, toward the mountains beyond. This was never the destination, it was a way station. "Yes," Arjun agreed, "but it served its purpose. You've activated the castle's defenses, learned to trust the connection between the artifacts. And He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. "I've remembered what it feels like to hope for something beyond mere survival." But even as he spoke, a new sound reached them, the distant howling of wolves that was not quite natural, carrying undertones that made Elswyth's skin crawl. Through the tower's windows, she could see dark shapes moving across the landscape toward Castle Nightfall. "Valdris," Arjun said grimly. "He's found us." The attack came at midnight, under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the stars themselves. Elswyth jolted awake in the chamber where they had made camp, her heart hammering as inhuman howls echoed through the castle's corridors. Beside her, Arjun was already on his feet, his pale eyes glowing with an inner light that spoke of supernatural alertness. "How many?" she whispered, clutching the music box to her chest. "Too many," he replied grimly. "Valdris has brought an army. Through the tower windows, she could see shapes pouring over the castle walls, vampires moving with fluid grace, their forms barely distinguishable from shadows, except for the occasional glint of fangs or claws. They came in perfect coordination, a force that had clearly been planning this assault for some time. "The crown," Arjun said urgently. "Do you know where it is? Can the music box tell us?" Elswyth opened the delicate silver lid with trembling fingers, and the familiar lullaby began to play. But now the melody seemed different, more complex, as if the castle's magical awakening had unlocked hidden harmonies within the tune. She listened carefully, her mind working to decode the patterns Princess Liana had embedded in the song. "It's not a place," she said suddenly. "The melody, it's not describing a location. It's describing a person." "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the chamber door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and ancient stone. Through the opening stepped a figure that made even Arjun take an involuntary step backward. Lord Valdris was tall and imposing like all vampire lords, but where Arjun carried himself with the dignity of old nobility, Valdris radiated cruelty like heat from a forge. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes were the color of dried blood. When he smiled, his fangs gleamed like ivory daggers. "Ah, the lost handmaiden," Valdris said, his voice carrying the silky menace of a serpent. "Lady Elswyth Ravencrest, scapegoat extraordinaire. Do you know how long I've been looking for you?" "Not nearly as long as I've been hiding from you," she replied with more courage than she felt. Valdris laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Hiding, my dear child? I've known exactly where you were for years. Did you think your little village was truly safe? I've had agents watching Thornwick since the day you arrived there." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. 8 years of careful anonymity, 8 years of believing she had finally found sanctuary, all an illusion. "Then why didn't you take me sooner?" "Because I didn't need you sooner," Valdris replied casually, stepping further into the room. Behind him came other vampires, his lieutenants, their eyes hungry and predatory. The sanguine crown was safely hidden, and I had other priorities. Wars to win, territories to conquer, rebellious vampire lords to discipline. His gaze flicked to Argen with unmistakable malice. "But then my old friend here began making inquiries about you. Started following trails that led inevitably back to that night 23 years ago. Suddenly, finding you became urgent." "You used me as bait," Arjun said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Of course I did. I knew you would eventually seek her out, and when you did, she would lead you to the crown." Valdris moved closer to where Elswyth stood, and she caught his scent, not the winter roses she associated with Argen, but something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in a tomb. "The only question was whether you would find it first, or whether I would have to take it from your corpse." "The crown isn't here," Elswyth said desperately. "Whatever you think you know, oh, I know exactly where it is," Valdris interrupted. From within his coat, he withdrew something that made her heart stop. It was an ornate dagger, its blade stained with what looked suspiciously like old blood. But it wasn't just any blade, it was the betrayer's dagger, the weapon she remembered from that terrible night 23 years ago. "Recognize this?" Valdris asked with mock gentleness. "It's the knife that killed Princess Liana. The blade that ended the royal bloodline of Valdemir. I've kept it all these years as a memento." Elswyth stared at the dagger, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. The princess's chamber filled with smoke and screams, armed figures moving through the darkness. And there, standing over Liana's fallen form, a vampire lord with a bloodied blade in his hand. But the face she remembered, the face that had haunted her nightmares for decades, was not Valdris's face at all. "You," she whispered, her gaze snapping to Arjun. "It was you. You killed her." "No," Arjun said urgently, his pale eyes wide with something that looked like genuine panic. "Elswyth, you have to understand, I saw you," she continued, her voice growing stronger with remembered horror. standing over her body with blood on your hands. I saw you kill the woman you claimed to love." Valdris's laughter filled the chamber like poison gas. "Oh, this is delicious. She still doesn't know the storm. Truth, does she? After all these years, she still believes the pretty story you've been telling her." "What truth?" Elswyth demanded, though she was no longer sure she wanted to know. "The truth," Valdris said with relish, "is that your precious Lord Argan was working for me all along. He courted Princess Lyanna on my orders, gained her trust, learned her secrets, and when the time was right, he opened the castle doors and let my forces inside." "That's not true," Argan said desperately. "Elswyth, you have to believe me." "Is it?" Valdris continued. "Then explain to her how you knew exactly where to find the princess that night. Explain how you bypassed all the castle's defenses. Explain why you were standing over her body with her blood on the blade you now carry." Elswyth's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Argan's knowledge of the castle's layout, his familiarity with Princess Lyanna's habits and schedules, the way he had known about the music, the box and its significance. Even his presence on their journey, he had been leading her to the crown all along, just as Valdris suggested. "The letters," she whispered. "The correspondence between you and Lyanna. You were feeding him information." "No," Argan said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "I was trying to protect her. I was trying to find a way to prevent what I knew Valdris was planning. But I was too late." "You were exactly on time," Valdris corrected with satisfaction. "Right on schedule, as always. My most reliable agent, even if you did develop some inconvenient emotional attachments along the way. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Not just Argan's betrayal of Princess Lyanna, but his betrayal of her trust over these past days. The growing connection she had felt, the tentative hope that perhaps her hatred had been misplaced, all of it built on lies. "Where is the crown?" Valdris demanded, his patience apparently exhausted. "Enough. Games. Tell me where she hid it, or I start killing everyone in your precious village one by one." "I don't know," Elswyth said numbly. Her world had collapsed around her again, just as it had 23 years ago. "I thought I did, but—" "She doesn't need to know," Argan said suddenly. His voice had changed, become harder, more decisive. "The crown's location is encoded in the music box's melody, but not in the way she thinks." Valdris raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "The song doesn't describe a place or a person, it describes a transformation. Princess Lyanna didn't hide the crown somewhere outside herself. She hid it inside herself, using magic that bonded it to her very essence." Argan's gaze flicked to Elswyth, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been apology or might have been pity. The sanguine crown became part of her when she performed the ritual, and when she died, it passed to her heir. Valdris finished, understanding dawning on his face like a terrible sunrise. But Lyanna had no children, no siblings. The royal bloodline ended with her. "Not the bloodline," Argan corrected quietly. "The bond of love and loyalty. The crown passed to the person she trusted most in all the world. The person she loved like a sister." Both vampire lords turned to stare at Elswyth, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite pain, not quite warmth, but something that had been sleeping for 23 years, suddenly stirring to wakefulness. "The sanguine crown," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "It's been inside me all along." Valdris's smile was triumphant and terrifying. "Well then," he said, drawing the blood-stained dagger with ceremonial slowness, "I suppose there's only one way to retrieve it." As he advanced toward her, Elswyth felt power beginning to stir in her veins, ancient, royal, and absolutely ruthless. Princess Lyanna's final gift was about to awaken, and she had the distinct feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The power that awakened within Elswyth was like nothing she had ever experienced. Not a gradual warming, but a sudden conflagration that swept through her veins like liquid fire. The sanguine crown's magic, dormant for 23 years, responded to the immediate threat with overwhelming force. Golden light erupted from her skin, and for one blazing moment the tower chamber was bright as noon. Valdris staggered backward, his vampire eyes narrowing against the radiance. His lieutenants hissed and shielded their faces, while Arjun stood frozen, staring at her transformation with something that might have been awe or terror. Magnificent! Valdris breathed once. The initial flare subsided. Princess Lyanna chose her heir well. You carry the crown's power, as if you were born to it. Elswyth looked down at her hands and gasped. They were glowing with soft golden light, and she could feel energy pulsing beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. But more than the physical change, she was aware of something else, knowledge flooding into her mind, memories that were not her own. Princess Lyanna's memories. She saw the ritual as if she had been there, Lyanna alone in her chambers on the night before the attack, using ancient magic to bond the sanguine crown to her very soul. Not to hide it from her enemies, but to ensure it would pass to someone she trusted completely. Someone who would use its power wisely rather than for conquest. She knew, Elswyth whispered, understanding washing over her like cold water. She knew Valdris was planning the attack. She knew she was going to die. Of course she knew, Valdris said with casual cruelty. I made sure she knew. Fear makes the final moment so much sweeter, don't you think? The golden light around Elswyth flared brighter, responding to her surge of anger. With the crown's power came other things, enhanced senses that let her feel the life force of every creature in the castle, strength that made her previous self seem frail as a child, and most importantly, authority over vampire kind that was absolute and undeniable. Kneel, she said, the word carrying power that reverberated through the stones themselves. Valdris's expression of triumph faltered as his knees buckled involuntarily. His lieutenants dropped like stones, their supernatural pride no match for the crown's ancient compulsion. Only Argan remained standing, though she could see the effort it cost him to resist. Interesting, Valdris managed through gritted teeth. The crown recognizes you as its rightful bearer, but power without experience is like a blade without skill, dangerous to everyone, including the wielder. He was right, and Elswyth knew it. The magic flowing through her was intoxicating, overwhelming, but she had no training in its use. Already, she could feel it threatening to consume her, to transform her into something as inhuman as the vampires she faced. Let us go, she said, trying to project confidence she did not feel. Leave this place and never threaten innocence again. Valdris's laughter was strained but genuine. Oh, my dear child, did you think it would be that simple? The crown's power is vast, yes, but it has limits. And he struggled to his feet with obvious effort. I have been preparing for this moment for centuries. From within his coat, he withdrew something that made the golden light around Elswyth flicker and dim. It was a chain not ordinary metal, but something that seemed to drink light and hope from the air around it. Elswyth recognized it from Princess Lyanna's memories, the binding of sorrows, an artifact created specifically to constrain crown-bearers who grew too powerful for their own good. You see, Valdris continued as his lieutenants slowly regained their feet, your princess was not the first to carry the sanguine crown. There have been others over the centuries, kings and queens, who thought themselves beyond the reach of consequence. They all learned, eventually, that even ultimate power has its vulnerabilities. The chain seemed to writhe in his hands, like a living thing, and Elswyth could feel its influence even from across the room. Her connection to the crown's power wavered, becoming uncertain, unreliable. Arjun, she said urgently, help me. But when she turned to look at him, she saw conflict written across his pale features. His loyalty was clearly divided, torn between whatever feelings he might have developed for her and his apparent allegiance to Valdris. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Truly sorry. But there are things you don't understand. obligations that predate my feelings in this matter." "What obligations?" she demanded. "What hold does he have over you?" It was Valdris who answered, his voice filled with malicious pleasure. "Family, my dear. Lord Argan is my blood child, my most successful creation. I made him what he is 300 years ago, and that bond cannot be broken by mere sentiment." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Argan was Valdris's progeny, bound by supernatural ties that went deeper than any human relationship. No wonder his loyalties were divided. He literally could not act directly against his maker without suffering consequences she could not imagine. "But that doesn't mean," Argan said carefully, his words chosen with obvious precision, "that I cannot provide you with information that might prove useful." Valdris's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What are you talking about?" "The Phoenix Flame," Argan said, his gaze locked on Elswyth's face. "In the castle's heart, where Nightfall kept his most dangerous experiments. It burns without fuel, destroys without discrimination. Even artifacts like your binding chain would not survive contact with it." "You treacherous," Valdris began, but Argan cut him off. "I'm giving her the same chance you gave Princess Lyanna knowledge of the trap before it closes completely. What she does with that knowledge is her choice." Valdris raised the binding chain, and immediately Elswyth felt her connection to the crown's power begin to fray. The golden light around her dimmed, and exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. But Princess Lyanna's memories provided one final gift: knowledge of the castle's layout, including the location of Nightfall's most dangerous creation. "The Phoenix Flame," she whispered, and even as she spoke, she was moving. Not toward the door where Valdris's lieutenants blocked the way, but toward the chamber's far wall where ancient stones had been carved with symbols of warding and protection. Her hands found the hidden mechanism that Princess Lyanna's memories showed her, and the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow passage that led down into the castle's deepest levels. She plunged into the darkness without hesitation, hearing Valdris's roar of fury behind her. "Stop her!" he commanded. But the passage was too narrow for more than one person at a time, and the first vampire to follow her met the business end of an iron candlestick she had grabbed from the chamber. The crown's power might be failing, but her desperation more than made up for it. She ran through corridors that grew warmer as she descended, following the path that Princess Lyanna's memories illuminated like a map in her mind. Behind her, she could hear Pursuit Valdris's voice echoing through the stones, promising terrible retribution for her defiance. The passage finally opened into a vast, circular chamber, dominated by a pillar of flame that rose from floor to ceiling, without any visible source. The Phoenix Flame was beautiful and terrible, casting dancing shadows on walls covered with warnings written in a dozen languages. She could feel its power from across the room, not the orderly authority of the crown, but something wild and primal that predated civilization itself. But between her and the flame stood an obstacle she had not anticipated. Other prisoners, dozens of them, chained to the walls with the same dark metal that comprised Valdris's binding chain. They were humans, she realized with horror, survivors from the villages that Valdris had destroyed over the decades. Their eyes were hollow with despair, but when they saw her, hope flickered to life like tiny sparks. "Please," one of them whispered, a woman, perhaps her own age, though suffering had aged her beyond her years. "Help us." Elswyth's heart clenched. She could hear Valdris approaching through the passage, could feel the binding chain's influence growing stronger as he drew near. There was barely time to reach the Phoenix Flame herself, let alone free dozens of prisoners. But Princess Lyanna's memories whispered to her of duty, of the responsibility that came with power. A true ruler did not abandon those under her protection, no matter the cost. "Stand back," she told the prisoners, and began working, put on their chains, with what remained of the crown's power. The metal was resistant to her magic, but not immune. It began to crack and weaken under her touch. "Foolish girl," Valdris's voice echoed from the passage entrance. "You cannot save them and yourself. Choose quickly your noble sacrifice or their meaningless lives." But as the first chain snapped and its prisoner stumbled free, Elswyth realized that he was wrong. She did not have to choose between them. The crown's power was not her only weapon. She had something else, something that Valdris had never understood. She had the love and loyalty that Princess Lyanna had inspired, passed down through 23 years of exile and preserved in the hearts of those who remembered what true nobility looked like. The freed prisoners did not flee as she had expected. Instead, they turned to help her with the remaining chains, their combined effort multiplying her own strength. "Together," she said, and the word carried power that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the human capacity for courage in the face of overwhelming odds. As Valdris emerged into the chamber with his remaining forces, he found not a single desperate woman, but a group of united survivors standing between him and his prize. And in the flickering light of the phoenix flame, Elswyth began to understand that the true power of the sanguine crown was not dominion over others, but the ability to inspire others to stand for what was right. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time since this nightmare started, she believed they might actually win. The battle erupted with the violence of a summer storm breaking against the mountains. Valdris's remaining vampires swept into the chamber like shadows given form, their inhuman speed and strength making them blur across the stone floor. But the freed prisoners, farmers, merchants, craftspeople who had thought themselves helpless, met them with improvised weapons and desperate courage. Elswyth stood at the center of the chaos, the crown's power flickering unpredictably within her as Valdris advanced with the binding chain held before him like a weapon. Each step he took drained more of her strength, but she refused to retreat toward the phoenix flame. Not yet. Not while others fought for their freedom around her. "You cannot win," Valdris called over the sounds of battle. "Sentiment is not strategy, girl. Love does not deflect claws." To punctuate his words, one of his lieutenants broke through the defensive line, seizing an elderly man by the throat. The vampire's fangs gleamed as he prepared to feed, but before he could strike, Argan appeared behind him like a vengeful ghost. The lieutenant's head separated from his shoulders in a spray of dark blood. "Argan!" Valdris roared, his composure finally cracking. "What are you doing?" "Choosing." Argan replied simply, stepping over the crumbling remains of his former ally. His pale eyes found Elswyth across the chamber, and in them she saw something she had never expected: love. Not the romantic passion he might have felt for Princess Lyanna, but something deeper and more enduring. The love of someone who had found redemption in serving a cause greater than himself. Valdris raised the binding chain higher, and Elswyth gasped as her connection to the crown's power wavered dangerously. The golden light around her dimmed to barely a flicker, and she felt her enhanced strength beginning to fade. But as weakness threatened to overwhelm her, she heard something that made her heart soar, voices raised in harmony. The freed prisoners were singing, not any song she recognized, but Princess Lyanna's lullaby, the melody from the music box that somehow they all knew. Their voices wove together in perfect harmony, and suddenly the crown's power surged back to life within her, stronger than ever before. "Impossible," Valdris breathed, his own strength seeming to falter. As the song grew louder, "The binding chain should work against a single crown-bearer," Elswyth said, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking. "But they're all connected to it now. All of them carry a piece of the crown's power because they chose to stand with me." It was true. As the song continued, she could see golden light beginning to emanate from each of the prisoners, not as bright as her own, but unmistakably the same power. The sanguine crown was not meant to be hoarded by one ruler, but shared among all who served the cause of justice. Princess Lyanna had understood this, had encoded it into the very structure of the lullaby that contained the crown's deepest secrets. Valdris's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. The binding chain was useless against so many crown-bearers, and his remaining vampires were being overwhelmed by opponents who fought with supernatural strength and coordination. "If I cannot have the crown," he snarled, drawing the blood-stained betrayer's dagger, "then no one shall." He moved with impossible speed, crossing the chamber in a single bound to strike at Elswyth's heart. But Arjun was faster, interposing himself between the blade and its target. The dagger pierced his chest with a sound like breaking stone, and he staggered backward into Elswyth's arms. "No," she whispered, golden light flaring around them both as she tried desperately to heal his wound. But the betrayer's dagger was more than just a weapon. It was imbued with magic specifically designed to kill vampires, and even her power could not undo its work completely. "The flame," Arjun gasped, his pale skin growing even whiter as his supernatural vitality began to fail. "Take the crown to the phoenix flame. Destroy it before he can—" "I'm not leaving you," Elswyth said fiercely. "You have to." His hand closed around hers with what remained of his strength. "The crown is too dangerous to exist. Valdris isn't the only one who would abuse its power. Promise me." "I promise," she said through tears. She had not realized she was shedding. Around them, the battle was reaching its crescendo. The freed prisoners had fought with courage beyond anything she could have imagined, but they were still mortal humans facing supernatural predators. Several had fallen, their sacrifice buying time for the others to reach defensive positions. But Valdris's vampires were adapting to their opponent's newfound strength, and the tide was beginning to turn. Valdris himself stood at the chamber's entrance, blocking their escape route while his remaining forces pressed their attack. The phoenix flame burned behind them, beautiful and terrible in its promise of absolute destruction. As Elswyth looked into Arjun's fading eyes, she realized that there was only one way to end this. The crown's power was vast, but it came at a cost that Princess Lyanna had understood all too well. To use it fully, to tap into its ultimate strength, the bearer had to be willing to sacrifice everything, including themselves. "Forgive me," she whispered to Arjun, and began walking toward the flame. The phoenix flame roared higher as Elswyth approached, its otherworldly heat washing over her like the breath of an ancient god. Behind her, she could hear Valdris's cry of rage as he realized her intention, but she did not look back. The crown's power pulsed within her, responding to her proximity to the flame with both eagerness and terror, as if the magic itself understood what was about to happen. "Stop!" Valdris commanded, his voice carrying supernatural compulsion that would have frozen any ordinary human in their tracks. But Elswyth was no longer ordinary, and her will was her own. She took another step toward the flame, then another. The sanguine crown began to manifest physically around her brow, emerging from whatever ethereal realm it had occupied within her spirit. It was beautiful beyond description, gold, so pure it seemed to capture sunlight itself, inlaid with rubies that pulsed like beating hearts. But even as she marveled at its beauty, she could feel its terrible weight, the burden of absolute power that had corrupted so many before her. Behind her, the battle reached its final desperate crescendo. The freed prisoners fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose, while Valdris's remaining vampires pressed their attack with inhuman savagery. Blood stained the ancient stones, and the air filled with cries of pain and triumph that echoed from the chamber's walls like the voices of the damned. But through it all, the lullaby continued, Princess Lyanna's melody rising above the chaos, sung by voices that refused to be silenced. And with each note, Elswyth felt her resolve strengthening. This was what the princess had intended all along, not to preserve the crown for future use, but to ensure it could be destroyed by someone who understood the true cost of power. "Elswyth, don't be a fool," Valdris called, and she could hear desperation creeping into his voice. "That power belongs to our kind. You're human, you'll never understand its true potential." She paused at the very edge of the phoenix flame, close enough that her clothes began to smolder and her skin flushed with supernatural heat. When she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity. "You're wrong," she said. "I do understand. That's exactly why it has to be destroyed." The crown lifted from her brow, hovering in the air between her hands like a captive star. Its power was intoxicating. She could feel the potential within it, the ability to reshape the world according to her will. With this artifact, she could end the vampire wars forever, could bring peace to the suffering kingdoms, could ensure that tragedies like the fall of Valdemir never happened again. But she could also become the very thing she fought, against a tyrant convinced of her own righteousness, wielding absolute power with the best of intentions until those intentions became twisted beyond recognition. "Princess Lyanna knew," she said, and now she was speaking not just to Valdris, but to everyone in the chamber, vampire and human alike. She understood that no one should have this much power, not vampire lords, not human kings, not even someone trying to do good. The phoenix flame reached for the crown with tendrils of pure energy, eager to consume the artifact that had caused so much suffering over the centuries. But before she could release it into the flame's embrace, Valdris made his final desperate gambit. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, the binding chain in one hand and a newly drawn blade in the other. But he was not aiming for Elswyth, he was targeting the weakest point in her defense. Arjun, already dying from the betrayer's dagger's wound, lay helpless on the chamber floor. "Choose," Valdris snarled, his blade at Arjun's throat. "The crown or his life." Time seemed to crystallize around that moment. Elswyth could see every detail with perfect clarity, the fear in the prisoner's eyes, the hope and desperation warring in Arjun's face, the cruel triumph in Valdris's expression. The phoenix flame waited beside her, patient and eternal, ready to accept whatever offering she chose to make. But as she looked at Arjun, this vampire lord who had found redemption in serving something greater than himself, she realized that Valdris had made a critical error. He thought she had to choose between the crown and Arjun's life, but there was a third option. One that would save them all and ensure the crown's power could never be misused again. With movements too quick for even vampire eyes to follow, she grasped Arjun's hand and pulled him to his feet. The crown's power flowed through both of them now, linking them in a bond that transcended the merely physical. Together, they stepped into the phoenix flame. The fire embraced them like a lover, surrounding them with heat that should have been agony, but felt instead like coming home. The crown's power began to unravel, its magic flowing out of them and into the flame, where it was purified and transformed into something new, not domination, but hope. From the melted remnants of the sanguine crown, Elswyth felt something small and simple taking shape. A ring plain silver, unadorned except for the promise it represented. Not power over others, but commitment to each other and to the principles they would defend together. The heart's promise ring settled onto her finger as the phoenix flame's work was completed, and she felt Valdris's scream of rage and defeat echoing from somewhere far behind them. The vampire lord's ultimate ambition had been reduced to ash and memory, while something far more precious had taken its place. Love, forged in fire and tempered by sacrifice, proved stronger than all the dark magic in the world. 3 months had passed since the phoenix flame consumed the sanguine crown, and the world felt different, not just to Elswyth, but to everyone who had lived through the shadow of the vampire wars. The oppressive weight that had hung over the northern kingdoms for decades had lifted, replaced by something that felt almost foreign after so many years of darkness: hope. Elswyth stood at the window of her study in the rebuilt castle nightfall, watching the sun set over valleys that were green again with new growth. The castle had been transformed from a ruin into something unprecedented, a center of cooperation between human and vampire communities. What had once been a fortress of isolation now welcomed visitors from both peoples, its halls echoing with voices that spoke of trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and the slow but steady work of building trust between former enemies. The New Dawn Chronicle lay open on her desk, its pages filled with her careful script as she recorded the true history of recent events. It had taken weeks to write down everything that had happened, not just the dramatic confrontations and supernatural revelations, but the quieter moments that had proven equally important. The conversations that had changed minds, the small acts of courage that had inspired larger ones, the gradual understanding that enemies could become allies when they chose to see each other's humanity. "Still working?" Arjen's voice came from the doorway, warm with affection and gentle teasing. The phoenix flame had healed his wounds in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Where once his pale skin had seemed cold and lifeless, it now carried the warmth of someone who had found his purpose in life. "Always," she replied, turning to smile at him. The heart's promise ring caught the evening light as she moved, its simple silver band more precious to her than any crown could ever be. Future generations deserve to know what really happened. Too many lies have been told about the past. It's time for some truth. He moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders as he read over the latest entry. "You're being too kind to me in these accounts," he said softly. "I made choices that caused great suffering, regardless of my intentions. And you made other choices that saved lives and brought hope to places where there had been none for centuries," she countered. "Both things can be true, Arjen. That's what makes us human, or as close to human as matters." Through the window, they could see lights beginning to twinkle in the valley below, not the fearful, barricaded glow of communities under siege, but the warm illumination of settlements that were expanding, thriving, reaching out to their neighbors rather than hiding from them. The village of Thornwick was among them. Its population doubled as people who had fled the vampire wars began to return to their ancestral homes. Master Willem had visited just the week before, bringing news of the candle shop's expansion and Thomas's promotion to full apprentice. The boy had grown inches taller in the months since Elswyth's departure, and his confidence had grown to match. More importantly, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. "I received a letter from Queen Cordelia today," Arjen mentioned, producing a scroll sealed with the royal arms of Eastmarch. "She's formally recognizing our alliance and proposing a treaty of mutual defense. 5 other kingdoms have expressed similar interest." Elswyth nodded, unsurprised but gratified by the news. The new world they were building required more than just good intentions. It needed legal frameworks, economic partnerships, and the kind of institutional support that would outlast any individual leader. It was slow work, sometimes frustrating, but infinitely more satisfying than the alternative of endless conflict. "What of Valdris?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Still in the dungeons beneath the castle, though I use the term loosely. The phoenix flame stripped him of most of his supernatural powers when it destroyed the crown. He's essentially human now, albeit a very long-lived and bitter one." Arjen's voice carried no satisfaction at his former master's downfall, only resignation. "He refuses all offers of rehabilitation. Some wounds, I think, go too deep to heal." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A delegation from the southern baronies was arriving to discuss trade routes, and there were reports of rogue vampires in the eastern territories who had not yet accepted the new order. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Arjen asked suddenly. "Giving up the crown's power? You could have reshaped the world according to your vision, ended suffering, created a perfect realm where justice always prevailed." Elswyth considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the past months. "No," she said finally, "because my vision of perfection might not be the same as yours, or as someone else's who came after me. The crown's greatest danger wasn't that it corrupted the weak, it was that it convinced the strong they knew what was best for everyone else." She turned in his arms, looking up into eyes that had seen centuries of change and were now witnessing the dawn of something entirely new. This is better, messier, slower, requiring constant effort and compromise, but better, because it's built on choice rather than compulsion, on cooperation rather than domination. Even when people make the wrong choices, especially then, the right to be wrong, to fail, to learn from mistakes and try again, that's what makes us free. Outside, the church bells of the Crises, valley settlements began to ring, marking the hour with bronze voices that carried hope across the darkness. No longer did they toll warnings of approaching danger, but celebrations of another day survived, another night of peace secured. Elswyth took up her pen and added one final line to the day's entry. The greatest victory is not the defeat of one's enemies, but their transformation into allies. The greatest power is not the ability to compel obedience, but to inspire voluntary cooperation. And the greatest love is not possession of another, but the choice to build something together that neither could create alone. She closed the chronicle and set down her pen. Tomorrow's chapter would write itself, when the time came. Tonight, she was content to simply exist in this moment of hard-won peace, surrounded by the warmth of home and the promise of a future built on truth rather than lies, hope rather than fear, love rather than power. The candles burned steadily in their holders, and Elswyth, no longer mute, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, smiled.